Welcome everybody to Political Science Objective C Notes. Objective C, explain and evaluate key elements of constitutional amendments other than the Bill of Rights, as well as the amendment process. Let's kick this off with an introductory question. Please consider this. Why wasn't the Constitution completed at the time of its writing? If the Founding Fathers were so smart, why do we still need to change the Constitution from time to time? Take a moment, write, then we'll get into our notes. All right, let's begin discussing the amendment process. We have only amended the Constitution 27 times. That is because it is really hard to do. Amending the Constitution is a time-consuming process that requires both political parties to work together. So, to do so, both the House and the Senate have to approve an amendment by a two-thirds vote. Two-thirds vote means it is a super majority. Or two-thirds of the state legislatures pass a resolution asking Congress to amend the Constitution. We've never done that second one. So after the House and the Senate approve the amendment, it's then sent to the states for ratification. So first, the Congress has to agree, and then the states have to agree. After Congress proposes it, 3/4 of the state legislatures must vote to ratify the amendment. They usually have 7 years in which to do this. So first you need 2/3 of Congress, which is very unlikely. Then you need 3/4 of the states to agree. That is also very unlikely. Think about how much difference there is in the states. You've got people in Texas who may not want the same things as people in Maine and everybody in between. So amending the Constitution is very difficult, and it was made difficult on purpose. We are not supposed to be tinkering with the Constitution just anytime we want. It has to be changed when we really, really need to change something important in our society. There have been thousands of proposed amendments, just amendments all over the place, but only 33 have ever received the congressional support needed to be proposed to the states, and out of those 33, only 27 made it into the Constitution. If you think about that, the Bill of Rights was added all at the same time. So the Constitution really has only been changed once for the Bill of Rights and then 17 other times. Here's a graphic that kind of shows the proposal and ratification process. You might want to pause the video here, take a look at this, make sure you understand it. This is an important thing to know, especially for question 1. Question 1, we have not had an amendment to the Constitution since 1992. In contrast, from the years 1913 to 1933, we ratified 6 amendments, including some of the most important in our history. What is different now than in that time period? Please consider that, pause the video, and write for a few moments, and then when you're ready, start the video back up. We're going to begin with Amendment 11, passed in 1795, back when the country was still very young. The 11th Amendment is somewhat complicated. It provides for something known as sovereign immunity. This means that a state cannot be sued in federal court unless it agrees to be sued, which sounds very strange. But what this amendment is meant to do is to protect the states from suing one another left and right, and from having citizens sue them left and right. It's supposed to show that the state is still an important level of government. There are a few exceptions to this, and this is how we usually get around the 11th Amendment. A lawsuit can be brought in federal court against the state's subdivisions. So if you want to sue the state of Ohio for something that happened to you in Cleveland, you might sue the city of Cleveland, or you might sue Cuyahoga County. You can't really sue Ohio directly. You have to sue one of the political subsidiaries. Also, Congress can remove a state's immunity. So Congress can get rid of a state's immunity and say, this doesn't apply here. And while you can't necessarily sue your state, you can sue your state officials. So if you think someone did you wrong in the state of Ohio, you might be able to sue the governor of Ohio or the attorney general of Ohio instead of the state itself. 12th Amendment, 1804. The 12th Amendment establishes the Electoral College. This is the indirect way we have of electing a president. Electing a president is a very complex process, and the Founding Fathers really didn't think that we were smart enough to do it. Each state has a number of electors equal to its senators and representatives in Congress. This group then casts a vote called the electoral vote that actually chooses the president. Our popular vote picks the electors and tells the electors what the people of Ohio think should happen. But technically, the electors do not have to vote with the people. They could cast a vote opposite what the people desired. This has not happened in Ohio. It has happened in our history as a nation, but never in a way that has made a difference. The Electoral College is seen as an improvement, where originally we had the person who got the second highest number of votes would be the vice president. We got rid of this system with the modern political party system being put into place. So now the president and the vice president are of the same political party. So that takes care of some nitty-gritty stuff. Then we get up into the Civil War. The 13th Amendment, 1865, abolishes slavery. 1865, as you know, is the end of the Civil War. As part of the end of the war, slavery was abolished throughout the country. The 14th Amendment passed a few years after the end of the Civil War, in 1868, ends up being one of our most important amendments. This amendment was put in place to force southern states to follow federal laws and to make sure that federal states like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, to make sure that they would give the full rights of citizenship to all citizens in that state. Because what the southern states did was they tried to go right back to the old way of doing things as soon as the Civil War was over. The 14th Amendment forced them to stop doing that. The 14th Amendment gives full citizenship rights to former slaves, and it gets rid of the 3/5 compromise, which we had discussed previously. Now, prior to this, the Bill of Rights only applied to actions of the federal government. So the federal government could not limit your freedom of speech. The federal government could not limit your freedom of religion, etc., etc. But states could do whatever they wished. The 14th Amendment makes the full protections of the federal government come down to the state level. But this was not done in a uniform way. The Supreme Court has used the 14th Amendment over and over again to force states to grant civil liberties that are guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. It gives citizenship to all the freed slaves and any children born in the U.S., but at that time it did not include Native Americans. This brings us to the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment gave all African American men over the age of 21 the right to vote. This was the last of what we call the Reconstruction Amendments. Amendments 13, 14, and 15 are Reconstruction Amendments. That's the time period in history in which they were passed. The 15th Amendment solidified the fact that African American men could vote. Question 2. Amendments 13, 14, and 15 are known as the Reconstruction Amendments because this was the time period in U.S. history in which they were passed. Why do you believe that we describe the period after the Civil War as Reconstruction? Further, how do these amendments contribute to the reconstruction of the country? Take a few moments, answer those questions, and restart the video when you're ready to move on. This brings us to the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment, passed in 1913, establishes the income tax. The income tax allows the federal government to levy a tax against your wages. Prior to 1913, the federal government had no systematic way of collecting taxes from everybody. But now, after the 16th Amendment, the federal government can take a percentage of what you earn. And that humorous coffee mug there says, the 16th Amendment is taxing. Ha ha. The joke here being, it is aggravating that the government takes our money. However, what do they do with the tax money? They do all the things we want the government to do. They support our military. They build roads and parks. They clean up the air. They pay for police officers and firefighters. The tax money gets used in a way to help the people of the country. And without the 16th Amendment, we would not have that. The 17th Amendment provides for direct election of senators. This was also passed in 1913. Now, some of you are probably unaware of the fact that before the 17th Amendment, the senators, the federal senators, were chosen by state legislatures instead of the people directly. It was believed that the people would not make wise choices about the Senate. So we left that up to our lawmakers at the state level. So for example, before 1913, the people in the state legislature in Ohio would choose who our 2 senators would be. After the 17th Amendment, the people choose who their senators were. This allows the people a much greater say in their democracy. Bringing us to the 18th Amendment, which turned out to be a very unpopular amendment ultimately. Passed in 1919, the 18th Amendment prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of liquor in the United States. It also prohibited us from selling liquor outside of the United States. The picture you see there, I think, is a fascinating one. This was one of the campaigns launched to pass the 18th Amendment, saying, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. And you have all of those stern-faced women there essentially saying that if you wish to be married to a woman, you cannot drink liquor. Liquor at the time, alcohol in general, was considered a real social ill, especially for men who would sometimes spend their afternoons and evenings drinking and neglecting the home. So the 18th Amendment was seen as a way to strengthen the American family. It did not do that. The 18th Amendment ended up prohibiting alcohol, and people kept drinking anyway, but they drank illegally made alcohol, which oftentimes contained poisons in it, and people died from intoxication. It also encouraged the rise of organized crime. You have the mafia stepping in to provide alcohol to people, and all kinds of other odd social things occurred after the passage of the 18th Amendment, which is why we will later, with the 21st Amendment, repeal the 18th Amendment. This brings us to the 19th Amendment, passed a year later. This gives women the right to vote. It is probably one of the most important of all of our amendments, as it finally gave half of the country, women, the right to vote. There you see a kind of interesting women's suffrage vote yes campaign in an Italian-American community in New York City. This was a big deal for women. This finally allowed women to begin to compete on a level playing field with men, because now their opinions were seen as being equal. The 20th Amendment, passed in 1933, tells us when the president begins and ends his terms, and it also tells us who becomes president if the current president dies. Before that, it was kind of assumed and it was practiced that the vice president would take over, but the 20th Amendment specifies very particularly if a president is to become sick, what should happen to him. The 21st Amendment, as I mentioned earlier, overturns the 18th Amendment and ends prohibition. There you see one of the parties that was held at the end of prohibition as people went back to drinking again legally and publicly. Question 3. The 18th Amendment was the only amendment that has been repealed. Think this through. Are there any other amendments you believe should also be repealed? Take a moment, pause the video, and then when you're ready, start it back up again. All right, moving right along to the 22nd Amendment, passed in 1951. This established that the president could only serve 2 terms in office. Now, as you know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was our longest-serving president. He was elected 4 times. He died in his 4th term. That was considered later on to be a bit too long. So now we limit our presidents to 2 terms in office. What happens so then the question becomes, what about the vice president? Well, if the vice president takes over the presidency in the last 2 years of the previous president's term, work that out in your mind for a minute. So president dies, vice president takes over, last 2 years of the original president's term, then that vice president, who then became president, is entitled to run twice for the presidency. This means that the maximum number of years you can be president is 10 under the 22nd Amendment. We haven't had anyone do that since 1951, but it is theoretically possible that if a president were to die and his vice president were to take over, and then that vice president wins 2 terms, he would serve 10 years under the 22nd Amendment. Bringing us to the 23rd Amendment, passed 10 years later in 1961. The 23rd Amendment allows the residents of Washington, D.C. the right to vote for president. When the country was first founded, there was worry that the people in Washington, D.C. would just be too powerful. They would be situated near the seat of government, so we stripped them of their voting rights. Also, Washington, D.C. is not a state. We only give voting rights to states. So we now allow the residents of D.C. the right to vote for president. Now, they are not full citizens of the United States exactly, however, because they still have no senators or representatives. They have no congressional representation, and they pay taxes. So they are unfairly taxed while not being represented in Congress, which makes a lot of Washington, D.C. residents quite upset. 24th Amendment, 1964. This amendment prohibits the poll tax. This was a tactic used by Southern governments to prevent African Americans from voting. By charging them some fee to vote, that made it so that poor African Americans were unable to cast a ballot. So the 24th Amendment was passed during the Civil Rights Movement as a way to stop Southern states from doing this. 25th Amendment, 1967. This is a more specific way to look at the terms of the president. This one deals with what we need to do if the president is unable to perform his duties for a temporary time period. This has happened a few times in our history. President Garfield was shot, and he was in a coma for 80 days before he finally died. In that 80 days, it was unclear who the president of the United States was. Was it the vice president? Did we have to have a new election? If the president is alive but unable to do his job, who becomes president? The 25th Amendment states very clearly it is the vice president. It also says that when a vice president becomes president, because the original president died or what have you, that the new president, who was the vice president, then gets to choose a new vice president. That's an interesting historical piece there. For 20% of American history up to 1967, we had no vice president because someone became president after the current president died. Then there was no procedure for choosing a new vice president. The 25th Amendment allows us that procedure so that we will always have a vice president, for whatever that is worth. Bringing us to the 26th Amendment. 26th Amendment passed in 1971 during the Vietnam War. Lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. You could be drafted to fight in Vietnam at age 18, yet you could not vote for the people who decided to send you to Vietnam until you were 21. This was changed with the 26th Amendment. There were broad fears in 1971 that the young people would then run out and start voting left and right, and they would take over the country, and that has just not happened. Despite many people's efforts, 18 to 21-year-olds remain the demographic group with the lowest voting rates in the country, which is something you should certainly think about changing since you are our young people. And lastly, the 27th Amendment, passed in 1992. This is the last time we amended the Constitution. This law prohibits Congress from raising its own salary unless they are willing to wait until the next congressional term. So when Congress does vote to raise its salary, it won't get that money until the next Congress is convened. So if the House of Representatives decides, hey, we all want to be millionaires today, they're going to have to be reelected in order to make that money. And the threat here is that the voters will not vote you back in if you vote to raise your own salary. This brings us to our final question. You are now familiar with the Constitution and all of its amendments. Given this knowledge, how would you alter this Constitution to best suit the needs of 21st century America? What needs to change in the Constitution in order to reflect the current reality of the United States? I hope you enjoyed the video. Please answer this final question, and I'll see you in class.